Greetings, everyone. I hope you all had a joyous, healthy, and inspiring Nowruz. As the inaugural director of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto, I welcome you to today's session of the Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series featuring Dr. Alexandra Buhler, who will speak on Zoroastrians during the Constitutional Revolution 1906 to 1911. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Buhler for accepting our invitation to speak at the Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series, which is co-convened with my colleagues, Professor Enrico Raffaelli and Professor Mir-Djalali. I also want to express my gratitude to our collaborator, the Federation of Zoroastrian Associations of North America, the Zoroastrian Society of Ontario, the Encyclopaedia Iranica Foundation, and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute, which has generously supported the establishment of the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies at the University of Toronto. At the outset, I would like to express our individual and collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people and acknowledge the land on which the Elahé Mir-Djalali Institute of Iranian Studies operates. For thousands of years, this land has been the homeland of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, learn, and teach in their ancestral homeland. My colleague, Professor Enrico Raffaelli, will introduce our speaker, and Professor Mir-Djalali will moderate today's session. Professor Raffaelli.
Thanks a lot. I'll just give a very short introduction. Dr. Buhler studied theology at Oxford University and completed her master's and PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, where she also taught courses about Zoroastrianism and Iranian history. Her PhD focused on the involvement of Zoroastrians in the Iranian constitutional revolution and the impact that the revolution had on members of the community. She is the author of a book that has been published very recently, Zoroastrianism in India and Iran, Persians, Parsis, and the Flowering of Political Identity. She currently works in libraries and collections at King's College London. Her presentation today is titled Zoroastrians During the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, so therefore today's presentation has a more historical angle than usual, but that completes, in a sense, the angles that we've been following so far in the Zoroastrian Studies Seminar Series. So Dr. Buhler, you can start.
Thank you very much, Professor Raffaelli, and thank you, Professor Tavakkoli Tarhi, for inviting me, and Bilal Hashmi for for tracking me down and all of the communications and organizing. It's a real pleasure to be here speaking to you all, and thank you all for coming along. I hope you'll enjoy my presentation. So I'll be examining the years of the Iranian constitutional revolution in relation to the position of the Zoroastrian community of Iran. It's not clear exactly how many Zoroastrians were living in Iran at this time. In the mid-19th century, there were estimated to be about 10,000 individuals, and this is likely to have increased by the early 20th century, but it was still a small community. Most were living in and around the cities of Yazd and Kerman, with several hundred living in Tehran and smaller communities elsewhere, for example, in Shiraz. I'll be looking in particular at the significance of relations between Zoroastrians in Iran and their co-religionists in India, the Parsi community, as well as relations between the Parsis and the British and Iranian Zoroastrians, so a sort of triangular set of relations. So the constitutional revolution came out of growing dissatisfaction amongst merchants regarding the economic situation in Iran, the impact of the Russo-Japanese War, the Russian Revolution on trade. Prices went up, merchants began to go on strike in 1905. Prominent clerics, Abdullah Bahani, Mohammed Tabatabai, also criticized the government, and members of the ulama joined protests. And this unrest continued over several months, and demands were being made for reform. Pressure was placed on the Shah and Muzaffar al-Din Shah by the ulama and the merchants, as well as members of secret societies. And eventually he agreed to the establishment of a national assembly and to constitutional rule. After months of protest, the Shah agreed in August 1906, and this led to the formation of a national consultative assembly, the Majlis, and to a constitution. And when the first Majlis met in October 1906, out of the 156 representatives, the only one who was not a Muslim, or at least nominally a Muslim, was the Zoroastrian merchant, banker, and landowner, Arbab Jamshid, who you can see pictured here. One photograph shows him with his staff from his trading company, and the other one by himself. And when he was elected, the Zoroastrian community in Iran welcomed his inclusion in the Majlis, and messages were sent from across Iran reiterating that he was to represent their community. But it was not only Zoroastrians in Iran who were pleased, but so too were Zoroastrians elsewhere. Iranian Zoroastrians living abroad, principally in India, as well as the Parsi community, the long-established Zoroastrian community of India, which included members of the Parsi diaspora who lived, for example, in England and elsewhere. And telegrams were sent thanking the Shah for Zoroastrian representation in the Majlis. And it should be mentioned that the revolution hadn't aimed to overthrow the Shah, but just to change how he was ruling. So Parsi views on the changing situation in Iran can be found as well in articles, for example, in Parsi journals, and in reports of talks and lectures given by Parsis. In Iran, with the relaxation of press censorship following the revolution, a plethora of new newspapers were established, including Nedai Vatan, which sometimes published articles from Parsi publications. One such article, translated into Persian from the English language Parsi journal called the Parsi, referred to a talk, Indo-British Trade with Persia. And this talk was given in London in November 1906 by Nawroz Parviz, a Parsi rail contractor and businessman. So Parviz was writing just soon after the Majlis first met, based in London. His talk was then reported in India, and that article was then translated into Persian, printed in a Persian newspaper. And Parviz had been the guest of Arbab Jamshid when he visited Iran just before the revolution. He praised Arbab Jamshid and was very positive about his position in the Majlis, which he regarded as a marker of substantial improvements in the position of Zoroastrians in Iran. He claimed Zoroastrians now enjoyed, I quote, a national reputation for enterprise, intelligence, and integrity. Parviz was not only interested in improvements the revolution would bring for his co-religionists in Iran, but he was also keen to point out that Parsis could take advantage of the new political order, as could the British. He suggested in his lecture that the British ought to strengthen trade relations with Zoroastrians in Iran. And he said, "There's one circumstance which I have for years past regarded as most favorable to British interests. I refer to the presence in Persia of a hardy remnant of the enlightened race and faith which held sway there for so many centuries until the Sasanian dynasty was swept away by the sword of Islam." And Parviz argued that with British support, Zoroastrians in Iran might emulate the success of the Parsis in India. He advocated the establishment of a Zoroastrian colony in the region of Sistan and warned that the rivals of the British, the Russians, were already planning to encourage Zoroastrians to colonize areas of northern Iran. So the content of this talk given by by Parvis, as well as the interest it generated in India and Iran, highlights elements of this sort of triangular relationship I was talking about between Zoroastrians in Iran, the Parsis, and the British, that I'll be looking at in relation to the constitutional revolution. But before I focus on the revolution, I just want to go back a bit to give a bit of background how these relations developed. So I'll begin by looking at Parsi relations with Zoroastrians in Iran. So by the time of the constitutional revolution, the Parsi community had been established in India for centuries, with most Parsis living in Bombay and Gujarat. According to the Parsi epic poem, the Qisse Sanjan, a group of Zoroastrians left Iran to escape religious persecution and eventually arrived on the west coast of India. And this journey is usually dated to the 10th century, Common Era. However, it's likely that due to trade links between India and Iran, there were already Zoroastrians living in India before this time. And there continued to be contact between Zoroastrians in India and Iran over the centuries. Texts were brought from India, and questions on religious matters were sent to Zoroastrians in Iran as well. During the Qajar period, a number of Iranian Zoroastrians emigrated to India, sometimes for economic reasons, sometimes to escape persecution. And the arrival of these Zoroastrians from Iran raised awareness amongst Parsis about the conditions of their co-religionists, many of whom were living in poverty. Parsis, on the other hand, had been able to take advantage of trading opportunities when Europeans arrived in India. And under British rule, they had been quick to settle in Bombay and had become a wealthy community. They were well known for their philanthropy, and this was often directed towards community affairs, to build temples for housing, rituals, education, as well as more public works such as water fountains. And then in 1853, a group of Iranian Zoroastrians who moved to India and Parsis, and sometimes they had intermarried, so the children of Iranian Zoroastrians and Parsis, they founded an organization, the Society for the Amelioration of the Condition of Zoroastrians in Persia, or the Amelioration Society. So this was a philanthropic organization, and they aimed to help Zoroastrians in Iran. And the following year, in 1854, they sent Manik Jilimji Khatariya to Iran, who you can see pictured on the slide. And the Amelioration Society had a significant impact on the Zoroastrian community in Iran. In 1882, the payment of the jizya, tax paid by non-Muslims, was cancelled for Zoroastrians, and this is often seen as the society's greatest achievement. Khatariya and other members of the society used positive relations between the Parsi community and the British during this campaign. So one example is the British helped facilitate meetings between the Parsis and Nasr al-Din Shah when he was visiting London in 1873. So there's an image of the Shah at the Royal Opera House in London. And during this visit, he met with a group of Parsis who put pressure on him to change the law regarding the jizya. The Amelioration Society also set up schools and encouraged religious reform. And whilst he was in Iran, Khatariya corresponded with intellectuals who glorified the pre-Islamic period of Iranian history and who regarded Zoroastrians as remnants from Iran's golden age. And when he returned to India for a couple of years in the 1860s, Khatariya encouraged Parsis to conduct more research into ancient Iran to compete with European scholarship. And the ancient Iranian heritage of the Parsi community was also increasingly referenced by Iranians who lived in or visited India. So towards the late 19th century, there was a greater volume of trade between India and Iran, and more Iranians were visiting Bombay. By the early 20th century, some Parsis were discussing the possibility of returning to Iran, their ancient homeland. And the reason for this was that there were concerns about the political situation in India and what the future might hold for the community. And these concerns tie in with the relations between the Parsis and the British. because the Parsis had overall done well out of British rule, so there was trepidation about what might happen if and when India gained independence. The majority of Parsis were loyal to the British and were not particularly involved in Indian nationalism, but there were some notable exceptions. And here you can see Bikaji Kama, sometimes known as Madame Kama, and Sir Din Shah Wacha, Sir Feroz Shah Mehta, and Dadabhai Nauroji. Nauroji, Mehta, and Wacha all presided over the Indian National Congress at least once, and this met once a year and made demands for reforms in the governance of India. So there were some Parsis who were very much involved in Indian nationalism, but other members of the community warned against Parsi involvement. For example, in 1890, Nusarwanji Shariaji Jinwala stated that the sympathies of the Parsis were all English and Parsis were wanderers from fatherland, and that they should steer clear of Indian politics. So Jinwala and other Parsis who were not in favour of involvement in the INC and Indian nationalism positioned themselves as Persians, as foreigners. So they were absolved of any responsibility to get involved in Indian nationalism. And this approach meant they did not have to jeopardize their relations with the British. And Madame Kama was critical of this and was praised by the Patriot newspaper, which contrasted her to other Parsis. And it says, some silly members of that community refuse to admit that they are natives of India. So many Parsis were worried that if there was greater representation in Indian governance, their political power would plummet. And a possible solution that was suggested in 1905 to overcome future economic and political decline was the establishment of a Parsi colony somewhere near or within Iran. And the idea was that this would have British backing. And then you might be thinking, would the British really be interested in backing a Parsi colony? But it's feasible that because of geopolitical factors, principally the Great Game, Anglo-Russian rivalry in Central Asia, and British fears about the safety of regions bordering India, that perhaps they would have given some support. There was talk of setting up a Parsi colony in Sistan, and this would potentially increase British influence in areas where there were worries about a Russian advance towards India. And the British had already been encouraging Parsis to take up trading opportunities in Iran. For example, an overland trade route through Sistan as another way of increasing British influence. But it wasn't just through their already positive relations with the Parsi community that the British hoped they might increase their influence in Iran. They also hoped that they might use these relations to forge strong relations with Zoroastrians in Iran. By the late 19th century, some Zoroastrian merchants had become very wealthy, including Arbab Jamshid, who headed his Jamshidian company, and the Shah Jahan brothers, who ran the Jahanian firm, as well as another merchant and banking firm. And the British tried to encourage trade between Zoroastrian merchants in India and tried to encourage Zoroastrians to learn the English language. Towards the end of the 19th century, the British and Russians were establishing more consulates and vice consulates across Iran, another form of their rivalry. And this was quite positive for Zoroastrian communities in places where the consulates were set up. For example, in Kerman, where you can see a picture of the British consulate there, Consul Percy Sykes intervened quite often to protect Zoroastrians. And on the right-hand side, you can see a picture of schoolboys from the Zoroastrian school, the Amelioration Society school. And some of them are wearing little medals you might be able to see. And those were given by Sykes as to encourage English language learning. So if the boys attended a certain number of English lessons, they would receive a medal. So by the early 20th century and the period of the Constitutional Revolution, we have Parsis and Iranian Zoroastrians living in India who are trying to improve conditions for Zoroastrians in Iran, particularly through the Amelioration Society. But there are some Parsis debating whether or not they ought to think of moving to a colony in or near Iran in the future. On the whole, at a time when Indian nationalism is gaining ground, relations between the British and the Parsis tend to be positive. Parsis sometimes use these relations as leverage to get British support for Zoroastrians in Iran, and the British hope that these relations might help them increase their influence, particularly in southern Iran. So the British are trying to also establish good relations with Zoroastrians in Iran, not just because the Parsis are putting pressure on them, but also because of their own interests and geopolitical concerns due to the perceived threat from Russia. So I've given you sort of the background of these relations, and now we'll see how they play out during the period of the constitutional revolution. So one of the seminal events that led to the Shah agreeing to the formation of the Majlis was the Bast, or sort of taking sanctuary, in the British legation in July 1906. And about 14,000 people were camping in the British legation grounds, many from guilds and merchants, and it brought sort of mercantile life to a halt. Religious life in the capital had also been disrupted as members of the ulama had left Tehran in protest as well. But the Bast in the British legation could continue for the length of time it did, which was about 4 weeks, partly because of the funds provided by wealthy individuals, including Arbab Jamshid. And there's a picture of huge cauldrons of food being prepared for everyone camping in the legation grounds. At the same time, although, as I mentioned, the jizya had been abolished in 1882, the Amelioration Society was still active in Iran. And at the time of the revolution, their emissary was Ardashir Reporter, who you can see pictured there. And he apparently facilitated the Bast by liaising with the British. And he hoped that constitutional rule would help liberate Zoroastrians in Iran from oppression. And he was among those who were spreading ideas about democracy to the protesters. He was a member of the Revolutionary Committee, one of a number of semi-secret societies active at this time. And the influence of members of these societies was one of the factors leading to protesters demanding a national consultative assembly rather than a house of justice that had been called for in the past. Initially, the idea was that all recognized religious minorities would be represented, but Christians and Jews were pressurized into accepting two of the clerics who'd been particularly involved in the revolution, Behbahani and Tabatabai, to act on their behalf. And so we have the situation where the only non-Muslim was Arbab Jamshid. Different accounts of this sort of appear about how this came about, that the Zoroastrians negotiated with the ulama, maybe that Arbab Jamshid gave quite a large sum of money to Behbahani, who then praised Zoroastrians during the election period. It also seems that some viewed Zoroastrians as having a greater right to be part of the National Assembly because of the history of their community and the prominence of Zoroastrian in the pre-Islamic empires. As I mentioned, Arbab Jamshid was, his inclusion in the Majlis was greeted enthusiastically by Parsis and other Zoroastrians in India. Naroz Parviz highlighted that his inclusion was a significant event, marking a change in how Zoroastrians were perceived. It also marked a change in how Parsis viewed Iran. And according to an article in an Indian journal, The Men and Women of India, there was renewed attachment to the fatherland and a revival of interest in its affairs marked the special features of the past Parsi year. But in India, it wasn't just Zoroastrians who were interested in what was going on in Iran. Indian nationalists also saw the revolution as significant. They thought it showed that the East was awakening, and in an annual report of Indian newspapers in 1905 to 6, the tone of papers was described as greatly increased in wildness and virulence, partly due to the situation in India, particularly the partition of Bengal in 1905, but also to do with external factors, revolution in Russia, and the creation of a representative assembly in Persia. So it was also inspiring Indian nationalists. But not all papers were critical of British rule, and amongst those that refused to be drawn into the whirlpool of discontent were a couple of Parsi journals, Jam-e Jamshid and Rast Goftar, so a reflection of Parsi loyalty to the British. And as I mentioned, Parsis were concerned about political reform and the potential decrease in their political influence. And this had sort of been highlighted when Manshurji Bhawnagri and Dadabhai Naoroji were both unsuccessful in their attempts to be elected in the 1906 general elections in London. And some Parsis were trying to push for the idea of having a separate electorate for legislative councils, like Muslims are trying to do, to try and guarantee representation in Indian legislative councils. But this approach was criticized by other Parsis who called it a retrograde act. And the Oriental Review, another journal edited by Parsi, said that Parsis should look to Naoroji, who first instilled into the minds of the Indian people a passion for nationality. And it's interesting, Naoroji was the president of the Indian National Congress in 1906. And in his presidential address, he explicitly contrasted the awakening of Iran with the revolution to the despotism being still experienced in India. So while Indian nationalists took inspiration from the constitutional revolution, some Parsis who were not so keen on political change in India argued that perhaps members of the community could return to Iran to partake in this renaissance of their motherland. And the concern being felt by Parsis about the changing political landscape in India was also noted by commentators outside the community. And one says, anonymous, I'm afraid, says, "It is good for the Parsi community that this remnant, meaning the Zoroastrians in Iran, has clung so tenaciously to its ancient home of Iran, which in course of time might give the shelter and protection of an enlightened government to a large section of the Parsis of India, now hemmed in on all sides by fearful competition." So there was talk of Parsis returning to Iran, but it was ridiculed by some members of the community. And here you can see an image from a Parsi journal, the Hindi Punch, which makes fun of the idea. And it takes a story from the Shahnameh of King Kay Kavus, who's on a flying throne, and the eagles are flying up, tempted by lumps of meat, but eventually they get tired, and then the whole thing topples down. And it's making fun of this colony idea. So on the picture of the king, it actually says scheme for Parsi colony. So it's just ridiculing it and saying that it's sort of doomed to fail, not worth doing, but it was being discussed. And Parsis were very keen to show their support for changes taking place in Iran, as they believed they had influence in terms of how Zoroastrians were treated. So when Muzaffar al-Din Shah died, in January 1907, just very soon after signing the constitution, Parsis were very keen to show their respect to the recently deceased monarch and to his successor, Muhammad Ali Shah, who you can see there. And messages were sent from Bombay, where Iranian Zoroastrians had closed their shops for the day. And you can see this is another cartoon from the Hindi Punch, and it depicts the baby is labeled the Persian parliament. So it's the fatherless child, the Shah has just died. And expressing loyalty to Iran was considered important. And this came up again when the Emir of Afghanistan, Habibullah Khan, visited India, just sort of around the same time when the Shah had died. And some Parsis wanted to give a very special address to the Emir in view of historical ties to Afghanistan and possible trade opportunities in the future. But others argued against it, saying it might be supremely injurious to Zoroastrians in Iran and that Parsis should focus on displaying loyalty to Iran. And again, the Hindi Punch makes fun of the group who are going to try and give this special address. And underneath the caption says, so one of the Parsi women is called Dina, and she says, The Emir is coming and there'll be a reception at Government House, another opportunity of shining. And her friend Gulcha says, or of cooling heels at the doorstop. There'll be such a crush. And Dina replies, but we'll claim priority as Afghan Parsis. So it's making fun of this idea. In the end, they didn't do a special address, and several newspapers expressed relief in view of the potential sort of impact on upsetting Muhammad Ali Shah. Another way that Zoroastrians could show their loyalty towards Iran was in economic terms, something that Iranian constitutionalists welcomed. For example, by financially supporting the nascent national bank. Arbab Jamshid was involved in this project and was listed as a founder, and donations were not accepted from foreigners, but Parsis were viewed as eligible to people to offer donations as they were seen to be Iranian. And Parsis were initially keen to support the project, and British Foreign Office records report that they were anxious to assist the popular movement, so instructed their agent, which I think must be Ardeshir reporter, to make all the necessary inquiries. However, the mood changed in February 1907 after the murder of Arbab Parviz Shah Jahan, one of the brothers who ran the trading and banking Jahanian firm. So Parviz was shot in Yazd on his way home from the bazaar, and various suggestions have been made as to the motive, including Zoroastrian support for constitutionalists, as well as anti-Zoroastrian feelings in Yazd, possibly local politics, as the acting governor owed Parviz some money. After this event, Parsis and Iranian Zoroastrians in Bombay were very concerned and pressed for British intervention. But this event had a big impact on their sort of attitude towards supporting the National Bank. And according to the Orientalist Edward Brown, who was particularly interested in Iranian affairs, this event directly affected their motivation to support the National Bank. Zoroastrians did continue to draw on their relations with the British in Iran and in India, and Parviz's brother contacted the British consul in Shiraz to get the British minister in Tehran, Sir Cecil Spring Rice, to exert his influence on the Iranian government to ensure that the atrocity should not go unpunished. And Zoroastrians in Tehran were also taking private steps to secure justice. As I mentioned, in Bombay, the murder caused newspapers said a great sensation amongst Iranian Zoroastrians, and the Zoroastrian Anjuman Council in Yazd had been appealing to the Amelioration Society for support. So from India, the president of the Amelioration Society, Sir Dinshaw Pettit, was quick to act and sent a telegram to the Prime Minister of Iran, Nasrallah Khan. Reporter and other Zoroastrians in Iran also contacted the Parsi politician Manchaji Baunagri in London, and he pointed out to British officials in London that merchants like Parviz often travelled between India and Iran, and for that reason, issues such as this should be of great concern to the British as well. So you can see lots of overlaps and these relations, the triangular relations coming into play. In Tehran, Spring Rice, the British minister, had already gauged the significance of the murder and had contacted the Iranian foreign minister, Ala al-Saltaneh, as well as one of the leading constitutionalist clerics, Muhammad Tabatabai. Spring Rice warned that care must be taken not to alienate powerful Parsis in exile who have considerable influence in the English press. And he also referred to a speech Tabatabai had given about religious equality and argued that in light of what he had said, he ought to ensure that the crime be punished. Spring Rice also stated that Parsis were keen to help Iran, their mother, and were at present consulting as to what they can do to help Persia in her present difficulties, possibly a reference to the National Bank. So the cleric Tabatabai instructed members of the ulama in Yazd not to hinder the administration of justice, and they were also told to preach in favor of Zoroastrians. Meanwhile, in London, the Persian legation reassured Parsis that investigations were taking place. But Zoroastrians in Yazd were still fearful for their safety, and Bounagri in London considered advising them to take refuge in British properties. A number did leave Yazd and headed towards Quetta, which was under British control. The suspected murderers were tracked down and there was a trial of sorts, but the suspects took refuge in a mosque, and Zoroastrians were then concerned that if they were arrested, there'd be a big backlash. So although there wasn't a decisive end to the case, Bounagri commented that Zoroastrians in Iran had written to him that the actions taken had helped prevent future further attacks. But this incident, the murder of Parviz, should also be seen in the wider context of discussions that were taking place about the supplementary laws to the constitution. So the initial constitution had been drafted in a rush, as it was clear that Muzaffar al-Din Shah was very ill and they wanted to get it signed before he died. And after the death of the Shah, the Majlis soon set to work on a supplement. And there were heated debates about the additional articles, especially in relation to the question of the extent to which the law would be aligned with Islamic law. And the murder of Parviz was linked to the question of what should be done to Muslims who committed crimes against non-Muslims. And according to Charles Marling, the British chargé d'affaires, disagreements over the legal position of non-Muslims almost wrecked the National Assembly. A vocal critic of the proposed laws and of the constitution more broadly was Sheikh Fazlallah Nouri, who had the support of the new Shah, Muhammad Ali Shah, who was also against the constitution because he was concerned that it would limit his power. The supplementary laws, which included one Article 8, which stated that all Iranians were equal under the law, were eventually passed in October 1907. And nationalists, sort of more secular nationalists, such as Hassan Taqizadeh, who's pictured here, had pushed for liberal laws that would strengthen Iran's reputation as a modern nation. But in the supplement, there had also been articles included to reassure members of the ulama. So Article 1 recognized Shiism as the official religion of Iran, and Article 2 stated that a council of clerics would approve legislation. But although non-Muslims were still at a disadvantage, Article 8 was significant, as it stated that all Iranians were equal before the law, meaning state law in this instance. And Zoroastrians in Iran had campaigned for Article 8 to be included. They'd written to newspapers highlighting the strong ties binding Zoroastrians to Iran. In petitions to the Majlis, they claimed that Parsis, I quote, proud Iranians, were considering returning to serve their homeland after 1,256 years in exile. Taqizadeh argued in favor of equality and said that the inclusion of the article would mean that there'd be a decrease in foreign intervention in Iranian affairs. And this can be seen in relation to Zoroastrians asking for the British for support. And the Zoroastrians had made the same point in a newspaper article where they stated that either they should be granted equal rights and be treated as Iranian nationals, or they would have to continue to rely on foreign support. And discussions were taking place at this time about the possible emigration of more Zoroastrians from Yazd to Quetta, and Bounagri was corresponding with the British Foreign Office on this matter. So the British were sort of interested in the welfare of Zoroastrians in Iran, but it's been argued that this situation changed when the Anglo-Russian Convention was signed in August 1907, a couple of months before the supplementary laws were agreed. And this agreement divided Iran into three spheres of influence: a British sphere in the south, a Russian sphere in the north, and a neutral sphere. And there had been no discussion with the Iranian government, but Britain and Russia maintained that the treaty respected the independence of Iran. These terms were criticized, including from some Parsis who were angered by the lack of respect given to Iranian independence. And here you can see this is another cartoon from the Parsi journal, the Hindi Punch, showing the Persian cat being tugged in both directions by Britain and Russia. So it's been suggested, for example, by Pierre Oberling, that with the signing of the convention, British support for Zoroastrians in Iran ended abruptly. And this argument is based on the idea that Zoroastrians were supporting the revolution, and so were the British until this agreement with Russia, after which the British didn't want to antagonize the Russians who supported the new Shah, who was anti-constitution, the constitution. However, I would argue that there is plenty of evidence that the British did still intervene to support Zoroastrians after this date. For example, a merchant, Behram Gushtas, was killed in November 1907, and after consulting with Ardeshir reporter, Cecil Spring Rice in Tehran made unofficial representations to the Persian government about the case. So despite the ratification of Article 8, Zoroastrians do still continue to make use of the British presence in Iran and the influence of the Parsis on the British to their advantage. And this can be seen again following the murder of another prominent Zoroastrian in January 1908, Arbab Fereydun Khosrow, who managed the Tehran branch of the Jahanian firm. I just want to say this isn't a picture of Fereydun. I couldn't find one, but this is Arbab Khosrow Shah Jahan, who I'll talk about in a minute as well. So early in 1908, there was considerable tension between Muhammad Ali Shah and the constitutionalists, as the Shah had attempted to dissolve the Majlis. And it seems that Fereydun was involved in the activities of a pro-constitutional group, the Anjuman Azerbaijan, which had helped protect the Majlis from the Shah's supporters. A few days later, January 1908, Fereydun was attacked in his home by a gang of masked men and killed. And contemporary accounts linked this attack to the recent tension between royalists and constitutionalists, and they accused the Shah and his supporters of instigating the murder. And Charles Marling, the British Chargé d'Affaires, described how the murder seemed to have a political motive because Zoroastrians had been supporting the constitutionalist cause. And he believed the aim was to frighten Zoroastrians and that Fereydun was an obvious target as he had, I quote, assisted the popular cause with money and arms. So after this murder, Zoroastrians in Iran reacted. They sent petitions. They said they'd have to leave their homeland if the situation did not improve. Constitutionalist newspapers expressed solidarity with the community, and the Majlis reassured the Amelioration Society that the government was dealing with the matter. But British officials also intervened. Marling contacted the Prime Minister. When he received reports that Zoroastrians in Yazd were being bribed, he raised it with the Foreign Minister, Moshir al-Dawla. Also, the Zoroastrian Anjuman in Kerman approached the British consul, Claude Ducat, when a Zoroastrian was attacked early in 1908. And Ducat stated that although Zoroastrians are not British subjects, I quote, they had always enjoyed our quasi-protection. And you can see this again in January 1908, soon after Fereydun was killed. One of the Shah Jahan brothers, Rostam, received threatening letters in Shiraz. And apparently these were similar to letters that Fereydun had received before his death. And the British consul, Thomas Graham, lets Rostam stay in the consulate and privately contacts local authorities and asks Marling to take up this issue with the Iranian government. And a petition was signed by other members of the British community in Shiraz, largely from the Church Missionary Society, and they were working there. And as well as citing humanity as a reason why Zoroastrians should be protected, they also mentioned that Zoroastrians were large representatives of our commerce. So here you see the commercial interests that the British had and the links with the Zoroastrian community coming into play. And the Jahanian firm was actually acting as agent for a British firm, Dixon & Co. And the Dixon firm from England also wrote trying to push for greater security for Zoroastrians. And apparently the situation in Shiraz improved a bit. Another of the Shah Jahan brothers, probably Khosrow, who's pictured here, asked Charles Marling to publicize British concerns for Zoroastrians and to place an emphasis on the economic role played by the community. And Marling agreed, and he wrote to the foreign minister, and I quote, "The imperial government cannot fail to recognize what a serious loss would be entailed upon Persia by the disappearance of an industrial mercantile community." And the foreign minister, Mushir al-Dawla, gave reassurances that the government would pay Zoroastrians, ancient subjects of Persia, special attention. A number of men were arrested for the murder of Fereydun, and this raised the question of how they would be punished in view of the signing of the supplementary laws and Article 8. And this led to debates because the accused were Muslims and Fereydun, the victim, was not. Calls were made for the perpetrators to be executed. And after a lot of arguing, an agreement was reached that they would be whipped and jailed. And the lashing was a public event, and the Jahanian firm then paid for celebrations afterwards. But a few days later, rumors were spreading around Tehran that two of the men had escaped, two of the accused men, possibly with the help of the Shah. And again, the British spoke out and made clear that they had a keen interest in the safety of the Zoroastrian community, specifically citing trade links. And again, the Dixon's firm offered to protect its agent. Khosrow Shah Jahan also asked to have a British passport, but he wasn't, that request wasn't granted because he was an Iranian national, but he was given some protection. But he did then end up going to India around this time. So over the next few months, there continued to be a lot of tension between the Shah and the constitutionalists. And in June 1908, the Shah launched a coup and the Majlis was bombarded and dissolved. And you can see a picture of the parliament buildings after that here on the left. A number of prominent constitutionalists were killed and others went into exile, including Hassan Taqizadeh, who went to London. This break in constitutionalist rule, which lasted a year, was known as the Lesser Despotism. In Iran, Iranian constitutionalists in exile tried to get support from their cause, including from members of the Parsi community in London. And for this reason, they emphasized the achievement of the constitution, putting particular weight on the idea of a religious equality. So Taqizadeh was aware that the Parsis were a wealthy and influential community. And after a lecture given by Edward Brown, Taqizadeh tries to get Parsi support by emphasizing that the constitution had significantly improved the position of Zoroastrians in Iran due to Article 8. However, at this time in Iran, Zoroastrians, particularly in the provinces, seemed to be targeted more than other groups in this general time of sort of unrest. And it's probably a combination of factors that crimes against them were less likely to be punished, their wealth, as well as potentially religious reasons. And during this period, they continued to make use of their relations with the British. And although the British stated that their policy was strict non-intervention, the vice consul in Yazd, E. Blackman, was reminded that he should offer unofficial help to Zoroastrians because of the interest taken in this community. After a year, the constitutionalist forces did take back control of Tehran in July 1909, and Muhammad Ali Shah was exiled, and Ahmed, his young son, was made Shah with a regent appointed until he reached adulthood. And the cleric, Sheikh Fazala Nuri, was executed, a significant event, the anti-constitutionalist cleric. And here you can see news of the new Shah being celebrated again in the Hindi Punch, the Parsi journal. So elections were now held for the second Majlis, which convened in November 1909. And in contrast to the first Majlis, now all recognized religious minorities were allocated a seat. And this enabled the communities to be represented in the parliament, but in a way it also solidified divisions along religious grounds within society. The representative selected for Zoroastrians in this time was Khosrow Shahrokh, who you can see pictured here. And congratulatory telegrams were sent to the Majlis from Zoroastrians across Iran. Shahrokh was from Kerman, but he'd spent some time in India for his education due to family ties with Zoroastrians in Bombay. He'd then returned to Iran and had been appointed headmaster of the Amelioration Society School in Kerman. So it's the same picture that I showed you earlier, and you can see him seated there. He was the headmaster of that school. And this was a time when the British were keen to win Zoroastrian loyalty in Kerman. So the council, Parsi Sykes, was not at all pleased when in 1904 Shahrokh left his teaching post to briefly become a Russian agent in Odessa. Shahrokh did not stay in this post for very long, and he then went to Tehran, where he worked for Arbab Jamshid. He'd been involved in politics before he joined the Majlis, for example, during the campaign for Article 8, and he was also a founding member of the Masonic Lodge, Bidariya Iran, Awakening of Iran, which was established in 1907, and many other deputies from the second Majlis were also members. He was well respected because of his, particularly his work in the audit office, and alongside his political work, he promoted a greater understanding and tolerance of Zoroastrianism in Iran. He wrote 2 books and distributed the first editions free of charge. And Shahrokh was also very involved in community affairs, helping to re-establish the Tehran Zoroastrian Anjuman Council in 1907, and he presided over it until his death in 1940. He was also the Zoroastrian representative in the Majlis until 1940 as well. So around the time that the second Majlis was about to convene, an article from a newspaper in Yazd highlighted the position of Zoroastrians living there, saying that they're still experiencing challenges. Some were making their way to India, others were taking refuge in the British Vice Consulate. And the article was very positive about the community, particularly about their economic contributions, and also stated that Zoroastrians were true Iranians and that Parsis ought to be encouraged to return to Iran. And this topic, the idea of Parsis returning, was being raised again in India, where news of the election of Shahrokh was being celebrated by Parsis and Iranian Zoroastrians. And talk began again about the relations Parsis had with their co-religionists in Iran and with Iran more broadly. So this talk of a possible return is reignited, and there's also a lot of discussion about potential trade opportunities. And at this time, some Parsis expressed their patriotism towards Iran. So you see, to commemorate the life of Mirza Jahangir Khan, the editor of a constitutionalist newspaper, Sur-e-Israfil, he had been killed after the 1908 coup, Parsis in Shanghai raised money for the population of Ardabil, a city in northwestern Iran that had been the location of fighting during the Lesser Despotism. And they also named a school after him. And these actions were celebrated in the Persian newspaper Iranica. So another key figure in the promotion of ties between Parsis and Zoroastrians in Iran and Iran more widely was a London-based Parsi publisher and writer, Nasarvanji Manikji Cooper. And he had been born in Bombay and then moved to London, where he lived with his sister Aimee, who was the first female Indian doctor practicing in London. And Nasarvanji ran a newspaper, the London Indian Chronicle, and he also published books. And some of these reflect his interest in Iranian affairs and the Zoroastrian community in Iran. And he dedicated one of his books to Arbab Jamshid and another one to Khosrow Shahrokh. Another of his publications the Zoroastrian Code of Gentlehood, was also translated into Persian and published in Tehran by Shahrokh in 1909. So there are these links through the medium of print between Zoroastrians in London and Iran, as well as promoting ties through his books. Cooper also organised events in London where he brought together individuals who delivered talks on topics related to Zoroastrianism and Iran. For example, in September 1910, the theme of one of these events was Persia and the Parsis of India. One of the speakers was the Persian minister in London, Mirza Mehdi Khan. Another was George Birdwood, and he'd been born in India and had worked there for many years and then moved to England where he worked in the India office. And at this event, Cooper said that because of the greater opportunities open to Zoroastrians in Iran, some Parsis were thinking of once more making Persia their home. And this idea gained traction again after the constitution was restored. Mehdi Khan tried to increase Parsi interest in Iran. He said Parsis were not considered a foreign community, but as one of themselves. He encouraged Parsis to visit Iran to see the respect and admiration that was felt for the Zoroastrians. And he claimed there were opportunities in Iran for enterprising Parsis whom the whole country would welcome. And similar views were expressed by the Parsi author Feroz Kershasp, who'd written about ancient Iran and had traveled to the country, which he described as completely transformed. And he was in correspondence with Iranian nationalists, possibly hoping that Parsis might give economic support to the Majlis. And this is also something that Taqizadeh and Edward Brown, pictured here, also hoped for. And Brown was involved in an attempt to set up a Parsi loan to Iran that didn't go through, but there were discussions taking place. As in the initial stages of the constitution, Indian nationalists more broadly saw recent events in Iran as proof that Asian countries were ready for democracy. But in contrast, Parsis tended to focus more on the benefits for their own community and for Zoroastrians. And an anonymous Parsi wrote to the Times of India about how he was concerned that the Indian climate had had a negative effect on the physical condition of the Parsi community and thought that life in Iran might be a solution and would make them rough and hardy. The Hindi Punch, again, says that Parsis had kept faith alive in a foreign land, India, and could now take advantage of the openings available and return to their fatherland. And this image you can see on the left, to Iran. It's from the 1910 Parsi New Year cartoons, and it shows the ghost of Nasr al-Din Shah, who abolished the jizya tax, as well as the ghost of Yazdegerd III, the last Sasanian king. And the two ghosts are discussing the return of the Parsis, who would work hand in hand with Iranians to help Iran rise to its former glory and power. And the caption underneath suggested that Parsis investigate commercial and industrial opportunities. And it mentioned that Ardeshir reporter, the Amelioration Society emissary, was asking Parsis to apply for positions in various government departments in Iran. So in the past, the Amelioration Society had been concerned with the position of Zoroastrians in Iran, but now Parsis were becoming increasingly worried about their own position in India. So the prospect of government positions in Iran may have appealed, as they were feeling marginalized in Indian politics. So this idea of greater involvement of Iran was a topic of interest. The front page of a Parsi journal, Rast Goftar, in September 1910, Parsis in Persia, stated that opinions were strongly divided over the economic prospects of Parsis in this transition period. If any moment was facile to the establishment of Parsi influence in Persia, it is the present. And they said that Parsis were regarded by Iranians as long-lost brothers, the ancient race of Persia, and it argued that at such a juncture, it is befitting Parsis should come to the rescue of their fatherland and acquire immortal renown, stamping their name on history and civilization. This was seen as an unprecedented situation. Such an opportunity has occurred after 1,300 years, and if it is let slip, will never recur. Not all Parsis held these views. An anonymous correspondent to the Times of India was very critical and said, Persian affairs are being keenly watched by the Parsis, and the recent revolution there has had a curious effect on many of them. These signs of awakening have led to visions of new fields opening out before them in that country. And sort of says that they're worried that with the end of British rule looking more likely, their influence in India might decrease. The future of their people, according to many pessimists among them, is gloomy in this country, but they can have a bright future in Persia if only they resume their connection with their former fatherland and seize the opportunities that present themselves under the new popular regime. So very positive perceptions of political change in Iran. And Cooper's events in London were reported in India. And there are other discussions taking place where Parsis would meet to debate whether or not they should invest in Iran. For example, the Parsi Authors Society and Writers Association discussed the question much canvassed of late, Parsi relations with Iran. At a similar time...
Sorry to interrupt the speaker, please, but if you don't mind to wrap up, because we are already 1 hour.
Okay, I'm almost...
time for any question, then I'm very sorry to interrupt you, really.
No, please, don't worry at all. So there was this discussion about going back to Iran and being more involved. And this did continue, but during 1911, advice from the British legation swayed many against the scheme. Some continued to promote it, including Cooper, and again Edward Brown spoke about the duty of the Zoroastrian community towards Persia, and gave a vigorous and earnest appeal to the Parsis to look upon Persia as their real home. But momentum was lost, particularly with the increased insecurity in Iran, reports that Zoroastrian in Kerman were being threatened, and then with the Russian advance towards Tehran at the end of December 1911, which led to the dissolution of the Second Majlis, and is often seen as sort of end of the constitutional revolution kind of period. Parsis, Zoroastrians in India did criticise the British for not acting to support the Iranian constitution at this point. And they were trying to use their relations, put pressure on the British government, but it didn't lead to anything. But here you can see a sort of criticism of what was taking place. And just to sort of wrap up, I hope I've shown that sort of throughout this period of the constitutional revolution, Zoroastrians in Iran, it did change their position. They had a representative in the Majlis. Article 8 improved their legal position. There seemed to have been some shifts in how they were being perceived. And they were able to make use of their relations with the British and with the Parsis to their advantage in terms of protection, securing justice, pushing for greater rights. And later on, from India, there was an article printed in 1913. So even though the revolution was sort of ended and there was no Majlis, saying that Zoroastrians are now viewed as descendants of the old famous Persians, even claiming that there were Muslims in Iran inclined to embrace the Zoroastrian faith. As I mentioned, Parsis in India were very interested in what was going on, partly because of their ties to Iran, but also their own concerns about their position in India. And although this sort of died down after 1911, it did resurface again with the rise of Reza Khan, later Reza Shah, in the 1920s. And the British had pressure from the Parsis to support Zoroastrians in Iran, but also had their own geopolitical and commercial reasons for acting to support the community. Thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I overran a bit. Oh, and if anyone is interested in getting my book or for asking a library to get the book, there is a discount code available at the end of that slide because it's extortionately expensive, no fault of mine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buhler, for this very interesting talk, and of course also for forwarding us the discount on your very interesting book. And because we are really running out of time, I'm very sorry. We will just have time for one, maximum two very brief questions. So if there is anyone in the audience who would like to raise any question, please, this is the time.
Hi, Alexandra. This is Jamshid.
Hello, Jamshid.
I read your book, so I can tell you it's a beautiful book, and it solved. You have access to many sources in India, not much in Persia, because they have not been exposed. But it's a great book, and you solved a great puzzle: the murder of Rashid Mehraban at point blank in Yazd Bazar. You remember that?
Yes.
So I'm grateful for that, because I've always been puzzled with that. Thank you. That's not the question. It's just a review of your book.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Then just a very brief question in the chat by Sagar Sadegian. This shift in momentum also appears to be noted by other non-Muslim communities, most notably the Armenian Christians from Russia. Have you had a chance to compare these patterns of external investment?
Sorry, have I had a chance to? Sorry, I didn't catch. So
I'll repeat the question again.
No, I can if you want.
You can, please.
Yeah, so because you were talking about the Parsis in India investing in the constitutional revolution, we have the same pattern of Armenian Christians from Russia investing on the same constitution, and both of them sort of got disappointed. And as you will mention, the momentum was lost. So I was asking if you had a chance to compare these situations.
I didn't have a chance to compare. I feel that it's such a big topic, but it would be fascinating to look at that in greater detail, because like you say, there's a similarity in the hopes and the efforts being made. I'm afraid I didn't have a chance, but I agree there's definitely some parallels there and similarities.
Well, then thank you very much again for our speaker, Dr. Buhler. Thank you very much. And please let me remind you also that we will have the next session and last of this academic year on May 9th with Dr. Salim Redar, who will also be giving a very interesting talk. So we look forward to having you here. And please, Professor.
Dr. Buhler, thank you for your fascinating talk. I really enjoyed it, and the connection of the Zoroastrians with the Iranian constitutional revolution, double belonging to India, to Iran. I also want to take this opportunity to thank Monica Buhler for joining us here today, your mother, of course. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm sorry I overran.
Oh, no problem. It was okay. It was a really good talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.